Dan Bongino was already red in the face. "You don't know what you're talking about," he barked, jabbing his finger across the table. His voice cracked from volume, not conviction. The cameras rolled. The host tried to interject, but it was no use. Bongino was in full blast mode, steamrolling logic with fury. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She sat like a cliff against the storm, unmoved and unmoving, her hands clasped, her eyes steady. The studio buzzed with invisible tension, producers shifting in their seats, viewers watching live beginning to lean in. "Let me finish," Bongino snapped, already 4 minutes into a monologue no one had invited. Crockett tilted her head slightly, a calm exhale. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his aggression. Instead, she waited. And then, with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a freight train, she said it. "You mistake volume for value, and that's why no one's listening." The air drained from the room. A beat of silence, then two. Dan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. On social media, the clip was already climbing. One viewer posted, "I felt that in my bones." Another, "She ended him with a sentence." Jasmine Crockett didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply returned to listening, her stillness now thunderous in contrast to Bongino's unraveling. The host blinked. Bongino looked off camera, searching for something to hold on to. But the narrative had already shifted. She hadn't just responded. She'd redirected the spotlight, and she did it without ever raising her voice. In a matter of seconds, the power dynamics in the room had inverted. The man used to dominating the conversation had been silenced not by censorship, not by interruption, but by the unbearable contrast of poise against panic. Tens of thousands shared the clip within the hour. Hashtags were born, screenshots circulated, like modern relics of a culture-starved audience finally fed. But what she said next left the entire studio speechless and sparked a viral storm no one saw coming. On the surface, it looked like another televised shouting match, a conservative firebrand unloading on a Democratic congresswoman in a predictable spiral of interruptions and finger-pointing. We've seen it before. We've grown numb to it. But this one felt different, because in an era where rage is currency and airtime is won by who can shout the longest, Jasmine Crockett didn't play the game. She broke the script. She didn't fight noise with noise. She didn't shout over Dan Bongino. She let the chaos play itself out, and then dismantled it with surgical calm. And that hit a nerve. Across the country, Americans have grown exhausted by political theater, by media food fights pretending to be discourse. We've watched as truth has been drowned out by volume, as decency has been rebranded as weakness. So when Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman, a civil rights attorney, a daughter of the South, held her ground with grace, millions felt something they hadn't in a long time: relief. Relief that someone could be smart and composed. That dignity didn't have to mean silence. That poise could be powerful, even viral. Because this wasn't just about two people in a studio. It was a mirror held up to a nation trying to remember what real leadership looks like. Crockett didn't just respond to Bongino. She represented every person who's ever been shouted over in a boardroom, in a courtroom, on a cable news segment, designed to humiliate instead of understand. She became the embodiment of what so many have been craving: a refusal to perform for outrage, a demand for something deeper. And in doing so, she reminded us that political discourse doesn't have to be a demolition derby. Jasmine Crockett is not a media darling. She doesn't chase cameras. But she brings credentials that can't be shouted down: law degrees, protest lines, committee work, and a reputation for cutting through the noise without ever raising her voice. In that studio, she didn't come to be liked, she came to be heard. And for a country teetering between apathy and anger, her calm wasn't just powerful. It was necessary. That's why the moment exploded. Not because a man yelled, but because, finally, someone didn't yell back, because it exposed a deep fracture in how America talks to itself. We've become a nation addicted to sound bites, allergic to listening. But Crockett's restraint forced us to pause. And that pause? It was louder than any monologue Dan Bongino could deliver. This moment wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a cultural fatigue boiling beneath the surface, of a quiet rebellion, brewing against the noise. It's why the video didn't just trend, it resonated. Why her words didn't just go viral, they echoed. But to understand the explosion that followed, we need to know who really stood behind that fury and who quietly stood above it. Dan Bongino didn't stumble into the spotlight. He engineered his own ascent from Secret Service agent to right-wing media juggernaut, carving a niche not through nuance, but through noise. He's not just loud, he's strategic. Bongino understands that in the age of algorithm-fed outrage, volume equals value. And for years, he's perfected a brand built on confrontation, certainty, and spectacle. His style isn't debate, it's demolition, not persuasion, performance. To his followers, he's a warrior, a straight-talker, a man who says what others are too afraid to. But behind that bravado lies a carefully cultivated persona, one that thrives on chaos, not clarity. He interrupts before questions finish. He reframes every point into an attack. He escalates fast until reason is buried beneath fury. On his podcast, in guest appearances, in congressional hearings, the playbook is always the same: dominate, distract, denounce. And yet, behind the megaphone is a mask. Because Dan Bongino wasn't always this man. He began as a Secret Service agent, under Presidents Bush and Obama, a profession built on silence, discretion, and protecting institutions. But somewhere along the way, protection turned to provocation. After retiring, he re-emerged not as a defender of norms, but as a destroyer of them, launching a political campaign in Maryland. Losing, then pivoting to punditry, where rage became his currency. It worked. He became a fixture on Fox News, a guest of choice for Trump allies, a star on conservative radio. Even after being banned from YouTube for COVID misinformation, he doubled down, claiming censorship, martyrdom, vindication. And through it all, he never blinked. To his fans, Bongino is the guy who fights back. But critics, and more quietly, former allies, have begun to see something else. A man whose bark has begun to expose cracks in his bite. His contradictions are hard to ignore. A former law enforcement officer now championing January 6th apologists. A man preaching patriotism while attacking democratic institutions. A self-styled truth-teller who cherry-picks facts to fit his narrative. But what makes Bongino especially dangerous isn't just what he says. It's how he says it. He thrives in environments that reward volume over virtue. In soundbite culture, he's a heavyweight. Not because he's right, but because he's relentless. And that's what made the Crockett interview so compelling. He came in expecting a sparring match. He expected volume, defensiveness, emotional fireworks. He expected to win by drowning her out, a tactic that had worked 1,000 times before. What he didn't expect was her stillness. Jasmine Crockett didn't engage in his war of attrition. She didn't flinch when he raised his voice. She didn't try to interrupt, outpace, or out-yell. She let him swing and swing until he collapsed under the weight of his own fury. Because here's the truth. When your entire persona is built on fire, calm becomes your kryptonite. In that studio, Bongino wasn't a firebrand. He was exposed. His interruptions didn't look commanding. They looked insecure. His certainty didn't sound strong. It sounded desperate. And as Crockett sat unbothered, letting him exhaust himself, millions watched the mask slip, not all at once, but in flickers. The awkward pauses. The sudden loss of rhythm. The look in his eyes when he realized the audience wasn't with him anymore. For Bongino, every conversation is a battlefield, but this time, he misjudged his opponent, because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to fight. She came to reveal, and while he played to his base with fire and fury, someone else was preparing something far more powerful: silence. Before she ever sat across from Dan Bongino, before the lights of the studio, before the viral headlines, Jasmine Crockett had already faced louder rooms. She was born in St. Louis, raised in Texas, shaped by two worlds: the blunt force of Southern politics and the quiet resilience of a community that had to fight for every inch of justice. Her mother was a teacher, her father a pastor. Integrity wasn't an ambition, it was an expectation. She didn't grow up seeking attention. She sought answers, and she found them in the law. After graduating from law school, Crockett could have taken the easy route. High-paying firms called. But instead, she opened her own criminal defense practice, not in marble towers, but in neighborhoods where justice too often showed up late or not at all. That's where she first learned the art of restraint. In the courtroom, she stood across from men who doubted her, older attorneys who interrupted her, judges who underestimated her, prosecutors who mistook her calm for inexperience. But Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. Her first major courtroom win wasn't flashy. It didn't make headlines, but it saved a young black man from years behind bars on a charge that wouldn't have stuck to someone with a different skin tone in a different zip code. She stood up. She laid out the case. And when the verdict came down, not guilty, she didn't cheer. She nodded. Quietly. With the same composure that would one day disarm a national commentator mid-rant. That's Jasmine Crockett's power. Not in the punchlines, but in the pauses. Over the years, she built a reputation as the woman who shows up. For voting rights, for economic justice, for criminal reform. Not in headlines, but in committee rooms, in classrooms, on protest lines. When the Texas legislature tried to roll back voting access, she didn't tweet, she traveled. She helped lead a walkout that denied quorum. She faced death threats, insults, arrests, but through it all, her posture never changed. Straight spine, measured words, sharp mind. When she was elected to Congress, she brought that same clarity to Washington, and it rattled people. Not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. In a chamber full of sound bites, Crockett asked real questions. She challenged. Power with poise. In hearings, when her colleagues postured, she performed surgery precise, factual, calm. And over time, the public began to notice. She didn't seek virality. Virality found her. Because in a political culture that confuses confidence with aggression, Jasmine Crockett is a quiet revolution. She represents a new model, one forged in dignity, not drama. A model that says you can speak up without shouting, hold the line without drawing blood, fight back without losing yourself. Her colleagues noticed. So did the opposition. At least one GOP rep was caught on a hot mic calling her dangerous. They didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was, because a woman who knows her power and doesn't need to prove it, that's dangerous to every man whose power depends on spectacle. It's not that Crockett hasn't faced disrespect. She has more than once. In floor debates, she's been talked over, cut off, misquoted, mocked. Once, a commentator referred to her as that emotional one. She didn't respond with outrage. She responded with data, receipts, poise. And with every moment she refused to take the bait, her credibility grew. Which brings us back to that studio. Dan Bongino didn't know all of this. He didn't know her courtroom history, her policy chops, her quiet advocacy. He didn't know he was sitting across from a woman who had built her entire life resisting the temptation to shout back. He only saw a Democrat, a black woman, someone he thought would fold under pressure or erupt. But Jasmine Crockett isn't new to pressure. She's made of it, So when Bongino erupted, Crockett didn't just stay calm. She executed a moment of rhetorical aikido that would echo across every screen in the country. By the 7-minute mark, Dan Bongino was boiling. "You people don't even understand how this country works," he shouted, cutting off the moderator for the third time. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, hands gesturing wildly, sweat catching the edge of his collar. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. The camera cut to her still, focused, composed, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes fixed not on Bongino but somewhere just past him, as if his tantrum wasn't worthy of direct engagement. He noticed. And that's when it escalated. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who doesn't even..." Bongino spat, then stopped himself, but it was too late. The implication hung in the air. The host tried to pivot. "Let's give Congresswoman Crockett a chance to respond." Bongino barreled back in. "No, because this is exactly what they do. They wait, they play victim, and they..." "She hasn't spoken in 4 minutes, Dan," the host said, voice tight. Still, Crockett said nothing. The camera cut to the studio producer in the back, eyes wide, hands frozen over the controls. Commentators in the green room watched the monitor with jaws clenched. On social media, the chat stream exploded. "Why is he yelling? She's letting him dig his own grave. This is getting uncomfortable." But Jasmine Crockett? Steady, not a flinch, not a twitch. Just silence, the kind of silence that isn't passive, but powerful. The kind that doesn't beg for attention, it commands it. And Bongino couldn't handle it. "Are you going to just sit there?" he snapped, voice cracking. "You're a sitting congresswoman, and you have nothing to say?" She blinked. "Once," he leaned in again, gesturing toward her. "What cat got your tongue now that someone's telling the truth?" For a beat, the air felt thin. No one breathed. No one dared interrupt. Even the host sat back in his chair, eyes darting between them. Crockett finally looked directly at Bongino. She didn't speak. Not yet. But the way she met his gaze, calm, collected, direct, it shifted the mood entirely. Suddenly, the energy wasn't his. It was hers. A viral tweet would later read, "He brought fireworks. She brought water. He was yelling. She hadn't said a word. And yet everyone could feel it. She was winning." And Bongino? He knew it too. He tried to recover, sat back, forced a laugh, turned to the camera like he was in control. But his eyes betrayed him. He glanced back at her, almost expecting a comeback, almost begging for it, because silence. Her silence was louder than anything he'd ever faced on live TV. Text messages flew, "Bro, turn on the interview right now." This woman is handling him without lifting a finger. Why is this so satisfying to watch? Then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, just a few inches, just enough to close the distance between deference and dominance. She opened her mouth, and what came out of her mouth turned the entire interview upside down. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean back in her chair or roll her eyes. She leaned in, and with the clarity of a closing argument, she began. "You know, Dan," she said, her voice even, "I've sat on criminal justice panels, defended people facing life behind bars, and worked in legislative chambers where we're supposed to deal with facts, not feelings." Her tone was calm, almost too calm for the weight of what was coming. "You keep calling this the truth," she continued, "but what you're yelling is just opinion wrapped in volume. Loud doesn't mean right. Passion doesn't replace evidence. And personal attacks? They're not policy." The studio went still. Dan Bongino froze mid-shuffle in his seat. One of the hosts darted a glance to the producer, who slowly raised both eyebrows. A tiny red light blinked on the control board. The clip was already being clipped. Crockett didn't stop. "I was elected by people who've lived under policies that were passed because people like you shouted louder than they listened. And frankly, I didn't come here to match your decibels. I came here to defend the people who can't even get a seat at this table, much less yell from it." Bongino scoffed, tried to interrupt, but she raised a hand not as a command, but as a signal of something deeper. Respect. "Dan, you've had 10 minutes. I'm asking for 3. He stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because something in her delivery made interruption feel small. "I don't care about clicks," she said. "I care about convictions not just in courtrooms, but in character." And there it was, the line, the kind that sticks to the back of your neck. On the studio monitors, producers leaned in. In the YouTube live stream chat, it was already being quoted, "Convictions in courtrooms." But more importantly, convictions in character. Someone stitched that on a shirt. Crockett turned her body slightly toward the camera. Not aggressively. Deliberately. She was no longer just speaking to Dan Bongino. She was speaking to America. We've made politics about performance. We've mistaken volume for value. We've rewarded the people who make the most noise, even when that noise drowns out those of us trying to do the work. She paused. A pause that punched harder than any insult ever could. She didn't yell. She didn't insult. She simply spoke. And that power? It hit harder than any rant ever could. Bongino shifted again, reaching for his water. His laugh this time was thinner, less confident, a tick more than a tactic. "I just think it's funny." He began. "You always think it's funny when someone like me speaks without raising my voice," she said, her eyes meeting his again. "Because that scares you more than shouting ever could." There it was again, not a jab, but a scalpel. Precise, intentional, irrefutable. The host blinked. He turned to Bongino, then to Crockett, then back to Bongino, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment breathe. He chose wisely. He said nothing. Crockett finished. "I was raised to believe that dignity doesn't require an audience. That leadership isn't how loud you talk, it's how many people you lift. So if you came here looking for a fight, I hope you brought more than volume, because I brought the truth." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Bongino looked down. The camera caught it. That single glance downward away from her, away from the lens, said more than any outburst ever could. The live stream chat lit up, clipped. "Give her a TED Talk." She ended him with elegance. On Twitter, the clip was already circulating, captioned with, "Calm chaos." Even the hosts, long trained to transition quickly, sat frozen in the aftershock. One finally cleared his throat and said, "Well, I think that speaks for itself." Bongino managed a dry smile. "You done?" Crockett tilted her head. "Wasn't yelling, wasn't interrupting. But yes, I'm done." Her final line wasn't a mic drop, it was something quieter, stronger, a full stop. And with that, she leaned back, poised, grounded, unshaken. Bongino tried to recover, threw out a sarcastic quip. It landed with a thud. The energy had shifted. Completely. This wasn't his segment anymore. It was hers. Clips hit TikTok, edits hit Instagram. Twitter blew up. The YouTube live stream doubled in viewers within minutes. Hashtags emerged mid-broadcast. Crockett clapped back, "Dignity wins." Mic drop moment. For once, the internet wasn't amplifying outrage. It was echoing restraint. People saw something they hadn't in a long time. A woman refusing to be pulled into the mud and rising above it instead. The contrast was undeniable. Bongino's fire had burned itself out, and what remained was the clarity of Crockett's words, delivered like truth carved from stone. But the moment wasn't just a clapback. It was the spark for something much bigger. It started as a flicker. A few tweets, a handful of quotes, a screen recording clipped from the live stream just minutes after it aired. Then it exploded. Within an hour, Crockett clapback was trending in 5 major cities. By midnight, it was the #2 hashtag in the United States. By dawn, it was everywhere: feeds, stories, reels, For You pages, group chats. You couldn't scroll without seeing Jasmine Crockett's face. Calm, composed, mid-sentence, mid-truth. TikTok users set her speech to music. Classical piano, slow jazz, trap beats. The edits flowed like waves jump cuts between her measured delivery and Dan Bongino's unraveling fury. One TikTok user, a young law student, wrote over the video, "This is advocacy." Another, "Crockett just did what every calm, brilliant black woman has done for centuries." Over on X, threads unpacked the rhetorical structure of her response like it was Shakespeare. One thread broke it down beat by beat, calling it the most devastatingly professional dressing down ever aired live. Another post went viral simply, stating, "Dan Bongino just got dismantled without her raising her voice once." It wasn't just political junkies reacting. Celebrities jumped in. Ava DuVernay posted a side-by-side still of Crockett leaning in and Bongino mid-shout. Caption, "One of these people is leading, the other is losing." Questlove tweeted a one-word reaction. "Chills." Gemele Hill called it a masterclass in composure under fire. Even corporate brands dipped a toe in. A coffee company reposted the clip with the tagline, "Stay strong, stay calm, stay caffeinated." It was wildfire not because of spectacle, but because of its subversion of spectacle. This wasn't the usual viral political moment. It wasn't bombast or breakdown. It was grace, and people were hungry for it. For every screaming match that had gone viral before this was its antidote. A cleansing reset. A cultural palate cleanser. Activist accounts reposted the moment not as entertainment, but as inspiration. One black educator wrote, "This is the voice I teach my students to find. Not the loudest voice, the voice with purpose." Meanwhile, conservative influencers scrambled to respond. Some called it a setup. Others insisted Bongino was ambushed. A few tried to meme Crockett as condescending, but it didn't stick. The footage didn't lie. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't baited him. She'd simply spoken. And that was the problem they couldn't solve. She hadn't broken any rules. She hadn't gone low. She had done exactly what they always claimed to value: personal responsibility, composure, facts. And she did it better. Commentators across the political spectrum were forced to acknowledge it. One right-leaning radio host admitted, "I don't agree with her politics, but damn, that was a kill shot without the noise." Memes erupted. Crockett as a Jedi. Bongino edited as a malfunctioning robot. One GIF simply showed Crockett sipping water, with the caption, "Silence wins." Within 24 hours, the full interview had crossed 3 million views. The original clip? Over 14 million. It was embedded in articles, shown on late-night TV, dissected by pundits. And through it all, Crockett didn't gloat. She tweeted just once. "There's power in staying grounded. Always." It racked up 500,000 likes, because this wasn't just a mic drop, it was a mirror. People saw themselves in her. The woman in the meeting who's always talked over, the student ignored until she speaks last and says the smartest thing in the room, the immigrant child taught to stay quiet but who finally finds her voice. By morning, the moment was on every feed. But beyond the memes, it struck a nerve in America. Because it wasn't about politics anymore. It was about posture. It was about who gets to be heard, and how power really speaks. And what Jasmine said in her follow-up turned the viral into the unforgettable later. That night, Jasmine Crockett posted a short video from her hotel room. No makeup, no script. Just her, in front of a lamp, the glow soft but steady. She didn't mention Dan Bongino by name. She didn't talk about the trending hashtags, the clips, the memes. She just spoke. I've been in a lot of rooms where people tried to make me feel small, she began. Law school classrooms, courtrooms, political spaces where I was the only one who looked like me or sounded like me. And I learned something in those rooms, something they never meant to teach me. She paused. That volume isn't power. It's armor. Her voice was calm, the same voice from the interview. Composed. Rooted. I don't clap back for attention. I speak up for accountability. Because I know who I am and I know who I represent. And I know there are people out there who've spent their whole lives being shouted over in their homes, at their jobs, in this country's politics. She looked straight into the camera. To those people, I want you to know, you don't have to yell to be powerful. And you don't have to insult to be heard. It wasn't performance, it was presence. She spoke for the daughter who learned to hold her tongue at family dinners. The teacher who lets others rant but saves her voice for something that matters. The immigrant who's been told to be quiet, be grateful, be invisible. Her message was simple, but it cut through. People are tired, she said. Tired of being talked at instead of spoken to. Tired of leaders who confuse noise with leadership. Tired of watching dignity get pushed aside for clout. And then she said what would later be quoted in classrooms, speeches, even campaign ads. Leadership is listening, not shouting. Listening, then speaking from a place that doesn't need to prove anything. It was no longer about that one. Interview. It was about a posture, a way of existing in a world designed to reward chaos. Crockett closed with one final reflection. I didn't go on that show to win. I went to represent. And I hope I represented you not just in what I said, but in how I said it. A beat of silence. A quiet breath. The video ended. But in living rooms, in classrooms, on commutes and message boards, the moment lingered because in a country where chaos has become a constant, where we're told that the loudest voice wins, Jasmine Crockett reminded people of something deeper, that there's strength in stillness, that there's power in patience, that sometimes the most American thing you can do is refuse to play the game. And as the studio lights fade from that unforgettable interview, what remains is not the yelling, not the theatrics, not even the clapback. What remains is her seated in silence, words still hanging in the air, and for once, the country was finally listening. Dan Bongino yelled, Jasmine Crockett didn't. And yet, when the dust settled, when the clips went viral and the headlines rolled in, only one voice echoed louder, hers. Because composure doesn't just survive chaos, it redefines the rules. In a world addicted to conflict, Jasmine Crockett reminded us that dignity isn't weakness, that staying grounded isn't backing down, that speaking with purpose, not volume, is the mark of true strength. She didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she didn't have to. So as we look back on this moment, the interview, the viral clip, the aftermath, we're left with more than just a headline. We're left with a question. What kind of voice do we want shaping our future? If you believe dignity is louder than shouting, like, share and subscribe. Because voices like Jasmine's deserve to echo louder than the noise. This isn't just commentary, it's a call. A call for more calm in the chaos, more truth in the talking, more leaders who speak like they've got nothing to prove and everything to protect. You watched a moment that made history. Now it's your turn to help carry it forward.